everyone, and welcome to After Alexander, episode 24, The Gallic Invasions. Last time, we left off with Anatolia slowly fragmenting and portions disappearing from Seleucid control. Where initially Anatolia had been more or less Seleucid, now a coalition was forming against them, headed by the city of Heraclea and the kingdom of Bithynia under Nicomedes. Where once Antiochus had felt secure enough to delegate responsibility to subordinates, such as Diodorus and Patroclus, now he and Stratonike had crossed the Taurus mountains themselves. This crossing came following the destruction of a Seleucid army by the Bithynians. What followed then was a conflict between the anti-Seleucid Northern League and the forces of Antiochus, most of which has unfortunately been lost to us. However, this week we're going to set the stage for the conflict having yet another dimension added to it. Specifically, we're going to talk about an invasion which the Hellenistic states had not seen coming and which would rock their world. An invasion by the Gauls. So, a bit of context on them is needed, I suppose. The Gauls we're focusing on started out in Central Europe, but in the early 3rd century BCE, two separate migrations started into pastures new. The first group moved west into the region that would later become known as Gaul to the Romans. The second group moved southeast and into the Hellenistic world. Now, I'm going to say at this point that I'm not going to delve any deeper into the history of the Gauls here. It's not a subject I'm very familiar with or can find a lot on, and I would not want to misrepresent it as such. So, for our purposes, just picture this double migration into both southern France and the Hellenistic world, starting out from Central Europe. Just know that I'm probably oversimplifying, and there's probably a lot more nuance to it than that. So, the impact on the Hellenistic world. Bevan notes, and I like to speculate not without some relish, that Ptolemy the Thunderbolt had the privilege of having to deal with this problematic situation first. So, let's catch up with what's been going on in Macedon while we've been away in Anatolia. The migration/invasion, call it what you will, was perhaps an opportunistic response to a conflict between Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and his nephew we mentioned earlier, Ptolemy of Telmessus. After the destruction of Arsinoe II's ambition in Macedon, the Thunderbolt was said to have been attacked by a son of Lysimachus and the Illyrian king Manunius. This son's identity is not certain from the primary sources, but they have been labelled as Ptolemy. And given that we've already seen two of the three sons of Arsinoe II die and leaving only Ptolemy alive, this is probably true. Manunius may well have been a king of a people group called the Dardanians, who gave shelter to Ptolemy of Telmessus after his stepfather's coup de grace. The war that followed between the two Ptolemies kept the Thunderbolt occupied throughout 280 BCE, and I'm not going to go into the details of it here, as for obvious reasons you'll see in a moment, the whole question is going to become moot in a moment or two. Accordingly, in either January or February 279, the Gauls invaded, led by a man called Bulgius. Now, the Gauls would have seemed terrifying to the Hellenistic states. The Gauls accordingly started marauding around the Hellenistic world, so something clearly had to be done. Accordingly, in 279, Caraunus sallied out to crush the Gauls. However, as he was by nature brash and impulsive, as we've covered several times already, he is said by the historian Diodorus Siculus as having shown no foresight or caution. His friends supposedly urged him to wait for reinforcements which were on their way, but Caraunus refused. In fact, the ancient historian Justin recorded that the Thunderbolt rejected diplomatic entreaties from Bulgius wanting to fight. He also declined an offer of 20,000 soldiers from a Dardanian king. Eventually the two sides met, and Caraunus was killed in battle, with his head being cut off and paraded on a spear around the battlefield. When they saw that their leader had fallen, his troops fled, and Diodorus records that the whole army was cut down and destroyed. Macedon was thrown into a state of turmoil by his death, and the whole of Macedon was overrun by the Gallic invaders in the summer of 279. Within a short period of time, a series of rulers would claim the kingship before being overthrown. The first challenger was Meleager, the full brother of Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and a half-brother of Ptolemy II. He only ruled for a few days before being ejected and replaced by Antipater II, Cassander's paternal nephew by his brother Philip, who we ran into in episode 19. Sosthenes, a Macedonian general, next took power and actually managed to defeat Bulgius, before running into the next leader who I'll come back to in a moment, Brennus. Next were Ptolemy, most likely referring to Ptolemy of Telmessus, a man listed only as Alexander in the text of Diodorus book 22, and even Pyrrhus of Epirus. The long and short of it is that there were a lot of potential claimants to Macedonian power from 279 onwards. Eventually, Antigonus II would seize the opportunity to regain Macedon for himself. Although, side note here, the sources I've been using are quite muddled as to what was happening with Antigonus II during this time. As we're going to come back to the Antagonids in a full episode later on in Antiochus' reign, I'm going to take him out of the picture completely again to avoid confusing everyone now. The Gauls retreated in the winter, leaving the wreckage of their pillaging behind them. More would follow. Brennus, who is described by Diodorus as the king of the Gauls, crossed into Macedon with 150,000 foot soldiers in 278 BCE. The Hellenistic world knew that it had to act, including Antiochus. To quote from Bevan, quote, "Although not immediately threatened, the Seleucid king shared the anxiety. Apart even from selfish motives, the deliverance of Hellas was a cause in which it flattered the vanity of any Greek king to shine." End quote. Incidentally, seeing as we've brought up Bevan, I need to mention that there's a discrepancy between him and our later sources in terms of dates. He places the invasion of the Gauls in 280 BCE, whereas every other source I've seen labels it at 279, and this difference of a year seems to carry on for a while. I assume that this simply means that the date has shifted over the years. So, 279 is the date I've gone with, although it's not what Bevan says, I assume it's the most up-to-date one. Anyway, with the invasion of this second Gallic leader looking for a place to settle in 278, Antiochus would send a division into Europe to deal with the threat. Fittingly enough, I suppose, a showdown would come at Thermopylae, where we've been before. 500 of Antiochus' men were tasked to hold the same passes that their Spartan ancestors had 200 years before. The Seleucid forces successfully held the pass at Mount Oeta from the Gauls, albeit with the death of their commander Telesarchus. But, again fittingly, the Gauls managed to get around the problem of the Seleucid vigil the same way the Persians had in the 5th century BCE by using the same mountain pass that they had. However, the Seleucid forces managed to flee via the sea. But the rounding of the pass meant that Greece lay open to the Gauls. Now, however, the defensive response of the Hellenistic world paid dividends. The Gauls and Hellenes met at Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo was. In this battle, the Gauls were crushed. Brennus was wounded in battle and avoided capture by killing himself. The Gauls tried to retreat back to the north, but very little of the army escaped. Greece was safe. As a quick aside, some of the survivors of this attempt would settle in Thrace, and we're going to come back to them when we focus on the Antagonids in a future episode, so probably keep them in the back of your mind a bit. However, now, we need to mention that, far from just having an impact in Greece, the Gauls had caused widespread disturbance across Hellenistic Europe. And to discuss this properly, we need to go through two more Gallic leaders, known as Leonorius and Lutarius. These two had broken off from the invasion of Greece under Brennus and headed east into Thrace, and, as Bevan puts it, quote, "levying blackmail as they went," end quote. they had got all the way to the Greek colony of Byzantium and harangued it, despite help sent by Heraclea and their other allies to the city. The Gauls also tried to cross the Hellespont into Anatolia, but Byzantium refused to give them any help in crossing, and they did not know how to make boats themselves. Instead, they took the city of Lysimachia by a ruse, and flooded into the Chersonese region. However, on the opposite side of the strait, a Seleucid governor called Antipater refused to give them passage, and the situation essentially devolved into a no doubt nervous stalemate, with Leonorius and most of their force returning to the Bosporus, and Lutarius initiating a staring contest with Antipater where he was. And it is at this point that the Northern League would help the Gauls accomplish what they'd been unable to do so far. Apparently, both sides in the fight over Anatolia had considered recruiting the Gauls for help. However, Antiochus delegate Antipater had not been able to make a deal. Instead, Nicomedes of Bithynia seems to have won them over. When Leonorius returned to the Bosporus with his men, a deal was struck whereby he placed himself under the orders of Nicomedes and swore to obey the commands of the anti-Seleucid League. With that, his men were taken across the Hellespont and into Anatolia. After this, Lutarius arrived, having managed to snatch some boats which the delegation under the governor of Antipater had used to cross into Europe. Lutarius and his men also crossed into Anatolia and headed northwest to link back up with Leonorius. So, Antiochus now faces the people who he once considered as potential allies, having landed in his territory. It's worth noting that the Hellenistic states were sometimes their own worst enemies with their squabbling. After all, the Gauls had proved unable to cross into Anatolia without Hellenistic help, yet here they were. Next time, Antiochus will have to deal with an enemy that has now abruptly turned up on his doorstep. In the meantime, thank you all for listening. For any questions or comments, you can head over to the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.